Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies through the Old Testament. Currently we are in the book of Ecclesiastes. This one's a little bit late getting out. I've been a little bit under the weather and wasn't able to get it put out last night. So we're one day behind. I'm still going to put it in as the Monday, so for people that are looking for it, they'll be able to find it by date. Anyhow, Ecclesiastes, interesting book so far. And when you read these things, I'll make mention of it, but you can see it's one of those things, we don't want to be too flippant about it, but you can see as he's working through this, Solomon's not having a good day. And it's going to be a real fascinating thing as we work through this book to see that there is a real sense of as he would see it, of the human existence, of its futility. And it's a really kind of a fascinating thing. I'm sure that we've all been there. So we'll look at that here. We're going to finish out the second chapter today. And then when we're concluding, I want to tackle an apologetic question that gets asked all the time. And that is, well, what about the people, and usually it's the hypothetical, that are in some tribe out in the middle of nowhere who've never heard the gospel? What about them? And so we'll answer that question as best we can, because you don't have unanimity in the church on how to answer that question. But I'll do my best to try to give us a plausible answer of how we deal with that. So we'll take care of that afterwards. And then finally, our Israel trip that's coming up in October. We'd love to have you with us, but we are going to run out of room on this trip. If all the people that have expressed interest to me end up following through with it, then we'll probably get to our capacity. So if you're wondering about it, you're thinking you might want to go, then contact me right away so that you can get in under that limit. If it turns out that we get to that limit, again, I'm going to try to cap it between 30 to 35 people. Much bigger than that, and it's very, very difficult for us to get from place to place. So we'd love to have you along with us. Contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and I'll be happy to send you the details on it. Okay, so Ecclesiastes. Once again, fascinating book. And the kind of the premise to it, and depending on who you ask, there are a little bit of variations of opinions of what really prompted all of this. Because it seems like it was not just a overnight open and shut kind of a thing. I'm going to investigate this. What we see in let's take a look there real quick. In chapter 1, verse 3, it says this: "What profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun?" And then he starts to go on, one generation passes away, and then he starts to get into that cycle that it just is what it is. And so he does that. He wants to explore that kind of question, do it kind of more on the intellectual side of things. What we studied last week is he said, look, I set my heart to this. I'm going to find out, because this is a man of pretty much, in that part of the world, kind of unlimited resource. He could build things, he could have things, everything was at his fingertips. And remember, on board in this guy's mind, who he is, this is a guy who has knowledge and understanding and wisdom in ways that man has never seen before. God made that promise to him. I'm going to make you like no one's ever been before or after you. So it really kind of lends itself to being a bit of a problem that way. If you're the guy who has almost unlimited resource, and you have a mind of kind of almost, from our understanding, kind of unrivaled, unmatched, you could try to dive into a question like this, trying to figure out what does it all mean, and drive yourself to the point of madness, which is a word that he uses quite often. So the pursuit is to try to find what's the purpose of it. It seems like it's just a never-ending cycle of futility. It's one generation to the next, and people come and go and nobody remembers them, kind of a thing. There was a futility to life that he sees here. So what he did is all the indulgence, and he found out that it was just nothing. There was no benefit to it. It was futile. It was frustrating to him, and you can get that. Now, let me be honest. I was thinking about this yesterday, and it is on a different track. So it's not Solomon's point, but I think a lot of us can get to the same place. Whatever it is that may be going on in life, you get to that point of just going, what is it? As a believer, we're different than Solomon if we have genuinely trusted in Jesus, and we know that our sin is forgiven, and that when we pass from this earth, our eternity is spent with him. If we have that assurance, there's really no question about what happens after. And so there's a real comfort and a peace that brings that Solomon couldn't understand. For us, it's a whole different thing. It's like, well, here on earth, we go through how many ever years the Lord gives to us, and then we will see him face to face, but there's a real certainty to our future. And the temporal things here are just that. They're temporal. They're not worthy, as Paul would tell us, they're not worthy of being compared to the things that are reserved for us. So I'm very comforted by that. The sufferings of this present life are not worthy to be compared to the glories that will be revealed. So Romans 8. When we get to that, read that whole chapter if you haven't done it in a while. There are some unbelievable promises that are there that if Solomon had known, he probably would have been a bit more of a content human in this. So when I read this, and I'll probably just read our whole section today before we start in it, and you just at the end of it, you think, Solomon's having a bad day here, or, kind of, do you need a hug kind of a thing, or is everything okay at home? You're worried that you're going to hurt yourself. That's kind of the thing that you take from this, because he kind of comes to an end of it all, and he realizes this pursuit of trying to figure out what makes it all work. Could I make myself happy and be content if I had everything at my disposal? Well, he tried it. And so he really did everything that he could do, ultimately to find out the stuff that he talks about here today. So fascinating guy, fascinating passage. And so let's turn there. We're going to get in chapter 2, or we're at chapter 2. We're going to pick up at verse 12. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll take a look at our text. Father, we thank you so much for the comfort that comes from knowing your word and from being convinced as we read the things that we see here, the questions asked by Solomon. There's nothing wrong with them. They are valid and important for people to understand, but seeing them from our perspective, since we've seen Jesus, is a great comfort to us, because many of these things that just vexed Solomon are really answered for us here in the church, and we have a peace and a comfort that he did not understand. So we give you thanks for that. We pray that we would walk in that newness that you have given to us, but we want also to just realize, as Solomon comes to, our life here is but for a time, and we give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. So I started to mention it, and I'll do this really quick. Any of you who have been part of the program, been watching for years or for any length of time, you know I'm not much about anecdotal stories. I don't tell a lot of stories. I'm not one of those kind of guys. But I got to tell you, I'm going to be 60 years old here in a couple of months, 3 months, and there is something just weird that starts to happen in the mind at that point, because you realize you're getting into your sunset years. Things are not as they used to be. So you start to look back at the things that have gone on in your life and big events. I'll be married 39 years this September to just an amazing woman. If you've never met her, my wife Beth, she's everything I could have ever hoped for in a wife. She's wonderful. And I start to think back of what our early life was like before our daughter Brittany was born and all that kind of stuff. And I think to myself, gosh, I would love to go back and do it all over again. And then you realize, but I can't. And I'm well past the halfway point of my life. I know that to be true. And I start to think about the people who have come and gone in my life. And some of them were younger when they left this world than I am currently. And it gets you to that point of just realizing that we're only here for a time. And that does, in some ways, that's hurtful to the heart in kind of ways that we see a little bit with Solomon here. But for the believer, there is an insane amount of comfort and peace that comes with that, because this is not all that there is. So when I hear that Jesus tells me, like if I think of John 14, where he says, I go to prepare a place for you, and that where I am, I'll receive you to myself, and you'll be with me there also. I paraphrase it a little bit. That's pretty close to it. I think it's verse 3. And that's right before he says he's the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father but through him. I find just tremendous comfort in that. And so at times like that, when I can get all melancholy, I am having to remind myself, we just finished the book of Revelation last week, and we got a chance to see the forever kingdom. And reading through those chapters 21 and 22 of the new heaven and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and everything that there is for us to look forward to. Ours is not a hopeless future. So it's a world that is just in horrible decay all around us. We see it. Lots of things happening in some cities around the country, and rioting and all the rest of it. The discontent that there is among mankind just tells you that this earth is very tired, and we await the return of the Lord. How wonderful that will be. So where we get to in Ecclesiastes, if you go back, if you didn't get a chance to watch last week, you'll know that he got to the second part of this. The first part was, of his mind, I'm going to try to figure out, what does it all mean? You know, what does it work, that verse 3? What is all of this toil and this trouble? What's the end of it? And he says, I want to find out what it is to enjoy, or to see what folly is like, and what causes it, and even to the point of madness, as he says, and pursuing after wisdom, what things are going on. So he indulged himself. And now we get to the point where, after looking through all that stuff, he kind of comes to some conclusions. And it's not as though he says, I'm so glad I did this, now I've got my answers. He has his answers, but I don't think he's in any way happy about it. You'll see that. So why don't we do this? We'll just go ahead and read verse 12 down to verse 26, and then we'll go back and look at them. And this is where I say, when you read this, you think, this sounds like a person who is really fighting what we would call depression. There's just such a futility to it, because it's not as though he doesn't know. He's now at the place where he would be able to say, I think I know these things. And my reply to it is, there's just despondence, is what you see here. So verse 12, then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. And that means I'm going to start to investigate this. I'm going to really kind of look into it. And I turned my heart to really kind of unpack everything that I'd learned. So he says in verse 13, then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than the fool forever, since all that now is and will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? And he asks the question rhetorically, and then he answers it, as a fool, just like them, not as the person, but just like them, no different than they. Therefore I hated life, because the work that I had done under the sun was distressing to me, for it is all vanity and grasping at the wind. Then I hated all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to a man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all of my labor in which I toiled, and in which I show myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and great evil. For what has man for all of his labor, and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, his work is burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy the good of his labor. This also it was from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is a vanity and grasping at the wind. So when you read that, you just think, this guy's really seriously troubled. And again, this would be the typical problem that you might find of a person who has so much and they don't find real satisfaction in it. Ultimately, it can't answer their questions. It can't make them ultimately happy. We have those stories throughout history. I think I mentioned it last week, maybe the week before. But some of the people that are just fabulously wealthy, the guy that was at Apple, Steve Jobs, I think I mentioned him. I think I mentioned Howard Hughes. Other people who have everything that this world could ever give them, and yet they were kind of hermits. They were unhappy. All of their success didn't bring them satisfaction. So the material world will always leave you wanting because there's always going to be something more. Or if you get to the point where you have it all, it just doesn't make you satisfied. So you can start to see he's changing a little bit in this, that he says this is what should have been the case. So interesting stuff that he has to say. So let's go back and we'll look at the text itself and make some observations and kind of work through it. Verse 12 tells us this: then I turn myself to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. And the consideration is, let me go back and if you remember in chapter 2, verse 1, he wanted to put these things to the test. In verse 3 of chapter 1, he said, I wanted to seek these things out. Now, here he tells you that he wants to consider, and that's just to perceive. I want to look into the details of all the stuff that I figured out. I built houses, I built gardens, I built pools, I built vineyards, I built orchards. I did all this stuff. I had servants, I had this grand house, I had it all. And now I'm going to look back and kind of work through what's there. So he said, I wanted to consider these things. I want to consider wisdom. And so wisdom is, again, if we try to understand what wisdom is, it is not just knowledge, but it's what you do with the knowledge that you have. If you make the right decision, that would be wise. If you know something and you don't do it, that's clearly not wisdom. So applying wisdom to these things, and then at this point of the madness, that's to the point of just indulgence of the things that he had done, to the point of just like some people would say, that's madness, that's insanity, it's just folly. And that's why it's closely related. Folly would just be the things of foolishness, to the point where it's just excessive, to the point where it's silly. So we got to that point, and he's done that. We studied about it last week, and all of it brought him to this point. So I wanted to look into these things. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So he puts the two at odds. I can do the things that fools do, folly, or I can do the things that wise people do, and wisdom excels. It's greater than just the trivial pursuits of life. It's that much greater than light is over darkness. So he's just giving kind of an idea that looking back on all of this, the trying to put all these things to the test really yielded nothing other than futility. And wisdom would have probably dictated, don't even try it. So I think he knew, if he's that kind of a wise, intelligent man, knowledgeable man, he should have known the answer to this question before he asked it. Is the creature comforts of this life, can you get enough of those things, or can you have enough knowledge and wisdom and understanding that will be sufficient to make you satisfied in this life? And clearly it doesn't. So in verse 14, he says this: the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all, which is starting to see where it's kind of that idea of depressing. But he says here, the wise man, the idea of where are they able to see everything? His eyes are in his head. It's not like they're in his pocket where they can't see things. And the difference is, do you see it or not? And so he says the wise person sees it. They are able to perceive, they understand those things. Their eyes are open. As opposed to the fool, or the person that he gives by contrast, the fool walks in darkness as though they have no eyes. They can't see any of these things. Now again, all of this he's saying because I put it to the test. So he's able to say, yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. So he could say you have the person that's wise, he sees everything, as opposed to the foolish man who can't seem to see anything, and yet they still have the same ultimate outcome. No one lives forever here, as he sees it, in the physical life. So again, I have to remind myself, Solomon knows that there is an afterlife to some extent, but nothing like we do. So Solomon, if he was a believer, this book would have looked considerably different. But as he said, I should say a believer, if he knew Jesus as we do in the New Testament sense, much of this book would sound much different. So here's what he does in verse 15. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? So it's like, with all my wisdom and everything else, I still have the same outcome as everyone else. And so here's that place where you get to it, where you just, again, you sense that futility and the frustration and just that gnawing feeling in your mind that what is it all worth? What's it all about? There's no answers. There's no contentment here. You can see it and you can read it and you understand where he's coming from in this. So then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. That idea that there's an emptiness to that the wise person could live by the wise dictates of their heart, guided by God, and the foolish person can go and just create trouble and strife, and their whole life is a mess, and yet they all come to the same outcome. Now, as he's saying these things, you can see that his focus is very much on the temporal world and not looking towards the eternal of things, which is kind of an interesting idea when we think about it, because the Christian thinks a lot more about the eternal things than they do about the temporal. Now, of course, we have to concern ourselves with what's for dinner and all that kind of stuff. We have to be concerned about those things, but we don't seem to necessarily fixate on those things like others can. So kind of an interesting thing. In the Old Testament sense here, he's not thinking more in the eternal, he's thinking more in the temporal. The worldly people, they do think absolutely in the temporal. That has not changed to this day. The difference is how the believer in the modern times, the believer in Jesus, looks at the world and perceives it completely different from even somebody like Solomon. So really, really fascinating stuff when you stop to think about it. So like trying to get into his head a little bit. And remember, when we study these kind of books, and any book that we're studying, it is for us to make observations. And so the observations are that, here Solomon's trying to get to the point where he feels that he wants answers. And so he does all kinds of things to get those answers, observations. So we see that at the end of it, he just sees this life is just filled with nothing but futility. And then the application part is like, well, what can we learn from this as well? So the focus on the here and now is something that really needs to be kind of kept at arm's length. It's not for us to get everything here on this earth. We are waiting for the one that comes. So we don't want to get stuck in the futility like Solomon does here, being so tied to the things of earth that they cause you vexation, frustration, all the different words that he uses, madness, folly, all that kind of stuff. Now, in verse 16, he says this, "For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever." Now, in the earthly sense, and again, things have changed quite a bit because we have ways of keeping record of people a little bit better than they did at this time. Yet we know a lot about Solomon, but his point is that they're just, they're going to be in the same field of a cemetery, and we can do that. We can read the headstones of people. We have no idea what they were like. So we can know if they passed around the same time. We don't know if one was wise and one was a fool. It's not remembered. We don't have their record. So there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool. And since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, and how does a wise man die? And so what's the end result of a wise man? No different than the fool. Same as the fool. So again, this is so cynical, and it's so, you can just see he's so frustrated by it all. And I kind of share this. I understand it a little bit. Again, the older that I get, every once in a while you just kind of sit around and you think it's probably not a great idea to stay idle, because you think about stuff you probably ought not to be thinking about. It's just vexing to the heart. But again, the hope that the believer has changes this quite often, or quite a bit. So he just asks the question. It's pretty obvious. What happens? What's the difference between how a wise man and a fool dies? There's no difference in it at all. So therefore, I hated life. Now, he hated life as the first thing he said, just the existence. I hated the existence of things because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity, it's empty, and it's grasping at the wind, something that you just cannot do. He's using these phrases kind of all over again. He uses them quite often. But his point is, you can't grasp the wind as it comes by. You can't jar it up. You can't keep it in your hand. And the idea of being vain, it's just empty. It's void of anything. So as he sees this, that you can be this wise person, just the normal variety, maybe not. Solomon is in a whole different category, so we know a lot about him. But somebody from his time, how many people lived in the nation of Israel that would have fit these two categories of the wise or the fool? We don't know anything about them. So they're forgotten to history. And so it is with the history of man from the very beginning. There are some who endure history, and we know about them through the ages. But by and large, you don't. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they were about. History forgets them. Their families may not, but even in time, that starts to fade. And he sees it. And so he looks at that as being just the way that life is, and he became distressed by it. He hated it. Interesting stuff. Now look at what he says here, because this is where it's quite interesting that this was actually proven. So he says, then I hated all of my labor, not just life, now the things that I had produced, the stuff he was talking about earlier in the chapter. I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to a man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will rule over all of my labor in which I toiled, and which I have shown myself to be wise under the sun. This also is vanity. It's an empty thing that I can do all of this, and I might leave it to somebody who's just going to make a mess of it. Well, we know who his son is, and I want to go look back at that. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles 12. And this is fascinating to me. So you can go back and read all about Rehoboam, and you can get a lot more information on him. We don't have time to go through it today, but I'll just give you the real quick review of what it was. Now, remember, as Solomon is alive at the time, he's the king over all of Israel. He was only the third king, but by the time that his next generation comes around, Rehoboam, the nation is going to split into two. So everything that he feared, Solomon, is going to come true in his son. All of his concern and all the rest of it, man, it happened exactly like he was worried right here, and we're about to read it. So in comes Rehoboam, and he's there to take the position, and there was another man in there named Jeroboam who fled to Egypt. When you read about him, he just basically said, are you going to continue doing the stuff that your father was doing, because it was burdensome, it was difficult. That's why Jeroboam left in the first place, because he was speaking his mind. So Rehoboam basically goes to his counselors, and he goes to the ones that have been around for a while, the ones who had wisdom, and said, you really need to step back a little bit from what your father was doing, and show the people that you can be careful about what their needs are, and show that you're sensitive to these things. My rendition. In come the young guys, and he talks to them and said, well, you don't want to show weakness, so you want to basically tell them, if you think it was tough under my father, you ought to see what it's going to be like under me. I'm not going to be weak. And so it ends up splitting the nation in two. So the thing that Solomon feared of leaving it to his son, really all of the things that Solomon had been able to consolidate in his time really got split between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So this is where we get Israel and Judah. This is at that split after Solomon dies, and it becomes his son Rehoboam who only gets the southern kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin. The other ones side with the north, and that's Jeroboam, not of the family, but they divide up the whole nation. And again, it's just a very bad history from that point on. It's grim, it's bad. So interesting that we read about that whole thing, and again, you can go back and check it out. We're looking here at 2 Chronicles 12 at verse 13, because we can just, with what Solomon's concern was, what about if the guy who takes over after me, my son in this case, is a knucklehead, and everything that I've worked for gets completely destroyed? Well, thus King Rehoboam strengthened himself in Jerusalem, and he reigned. Now, Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah, and she was an Ammonitess. There's a problem, because the now king of Israel has a pagan mother, from a pagan origin. She's an Ammonitess. This already tells you how messed up things had been. And the same Solomon who's talking about all the bad decisions I made, well, here's one. Verse 14. This is about Rehoboam. He did evil because he did not prepare his heart to seek the Lord. So everything that Solomon could have worried about is seen and realized in Rehoboam, and ultimately in Jeroboam as well. Now with Rehoboam, it was that he didn't seek the Lord, but that really is why you make so many other bad decisions. If he had gone to the Lord and said, when people had come to him and said, you got to really kind of rethink what your dad was doing, if he consulted the Lord would have had good counsel for him. Instead, he followed the bad counsel. So, verse 15, the acts of Rehoboam, first and last, are they not written in the book of Shemaiah the prophet, and of Iddo the seer, concerning genealogies? And there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all of their days. So he rested with his fathers, the way that they all end. So everything that Solomon was concerned about has come true in his son, who turned out to be a complete disaster. So when you look at it like that, you just think, man, the thing that he feared the most after all of his examination was, you know what? I indulged myself and I've amassed everything that I could have ever had that would have made me happy. Turns out it's really just folly and madness, and it's not as much wisdom. And so all that I've put together, I'm going to die and I can't take it with me, and it's going to be left to someone else. I wonder what they're going to be like. And so he has his answer, but not while he's alive. We have the answer because we know what happened with his son. Verse 20 tells us this: "Now therefore I turned my heart and I despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and great evil." Now, again, the interesting thing that you can see, and we see it in our society all the time, a lot of times if people have a great deal of wealth and power, and their kids grow up that way, the kids can sometimes become very enamored with it and have that sense of entitlement. And so you can't tell them anything. They're just cruel. They get everything that they want. They're never told no, and they're just impossible. And is that what really is Rehoboam's problem? Well, he certainly had something wrong in the way that this was. He didn't seek the Lord. And that really, if you think about it, that has a lot probably to do, he wouldn't have learned it from his mom. And his dad was in a place of compromise because of his mother. We already read about that, that his wives turned his heart from the Lord. So Rehoboam had all the trappings of a life of just absolute freedom from want and need. He had everything a person could ever want, but he didn't have godly counsel. He didn't seek the Lord from the beginning. If you're going to be the king of Israel, you would figure that you would go and consult with the Lord, who really kind of established the nation to begin with, but he didn't do that. So I don't think any of us would have looked at this and thought it's going to end well. Of course it won't. So really, think about this. After Solomon's dead, his concern that he has here, this is where the division of the nation, Israel and Judah, began. So yeah, all these things that I've done, it's going to be left to someone else, and I don't know what they're going to be like. Well, you want to start saying, well, maybe this is when you want to start pouring into your kid a little bit more, Solomon. But again, we don't know exactly where was he writing this in that timeline. We know that Rehoboam was, 41 when he took over. So he'd had a whole lifetime to kind of come to his conclusions, but they obviously weren't good. They didn't serve him well. So he says, this is just vanity, and it's a great evil. The idea that I can't have any idea who's coming after me and what they're going to do. Will they take everything that I've done and the wisdom employed in it and all of what I've done? Will they continue that, or will they just squander it? It's just to him, it's a vexing thing. It's just evil. It's vexing. And there's an emptiness to it. For what has man for all of his labor, and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? So again, what has man for all of his labor? He kind of returns to that once again, kind of the same thing that he started the book with in verse 3. So at the end of it all, he says, I can do all these things. I had the ability and I did them. I pursued the understanding of it, took the intellectual approach, did the indulgent approach, did all of it. And what's left? What is it? It's going to be, I'm only here for a while. I'm going to die just like the other people that no one will ever hear of. Just like the fool and the wise person alike, I'll go to the same place that they did. And the person that I'm leaving it to, I have no clue what they're going to be like. Pretty heavy stuff. So again, you get to the point where you say, this is just depressing when you read it. But that's only if you buy into the premise or the way that it's presented so far. Now, he's going to have a lot more to say. And, this is kind of setting it up. This is what got me to the point where I wrote this whole book. Let me give you the backstory to it. We're reading the backstory. So when we read this, we want to say this, what we can take away from it, the material pursuits of this life will never give any kind of satisfaction. And the more that you try to pursue them, the less satisfied you're going to be. They'll never be able to meet what you need. So in verse 23, for all his days are sorrowful, and his work is burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. And I'm sure we all understand this. We've all had those times well, I shouldn't say all. There are some rare occasions where people are different, but there may be some things at times that you go through that are really heavy on your mind, and you can't even get rest at night. You stay awake looking at the ceiling because you're working through all the stuff that's going on. In this case, what he says, I can't get any sleep because I'm just pondering all this stuff. After doing my inquiry into all of this and doing all of my works, it's just going to be left to somebody else, and I don't even know what they're going to do with it. And it keeps me awake at night, that kind of thing. I mean, that's a phrase for a reason. It keeps me awake at night. That's kind of what he's getting to here. A person can get to the point where they can't even sleep escapes them because they're so troubled by the things going on. Now, he says this. So, for his days are sorrowful, his work is burdensome, even in the night, his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. That's so empty, that truth. So he says, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in its labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. So God revealed this to him. It just took the long way of getting around. If I have these things that God gives to me, I should be content in those things. And rather than trying to amass more to myself, and we looked at this last week about the man that Jesus speaks about in the parable, about my crops have yielded so much, I don't even have room to put all my stuff. I'm going to just tear down the old barns and build new ones bigger, and they'll be able to take all of what I have, and then I'll be able to relax. And he's told, well, you're not going to make it through the night. This night, your life's going to be required of you. And then, so what's the use of it? It's as though when Jesus was teaching that parable, he's thinking Solomon as he's saying those, because it's parallel track kind of stuff here. So here, this is the idea of why is it not a good thing if a person could just say, how about I be content with what God has provided? And that's where he seems to be right here. Why don't I take my leave of just all of the labors and enjoy the things that God has given to me? And he sees that not only are those things given by God, but even the understanding of being content with those things. That should have been sufficient. So this is kind of his summary as he looks through that. Now, he goes on, verse 3 again, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. And so his life, as we've already read, he would get done with something, but he would pursue on to the next thing and never take any enjoyment from it. And so he said, there's nothing better that a person should be able to enjoy what God has provided for him. For who can eat or who can drink or have enjoyment more than I? So his point was, nobody would be able to put this to the test like I could. Because not only did he have the equipment from the neck up, but he had riches in ways nobody had ever seen before. And nothing stood in his way. He had no limit to his resource. So his point was, if anybody wants to have this discussion, I put it to the test, and there's nobody quite like me for the ability to do exactly what I did. So we see in verse 24, for God gives wisdom, and this is his summation. And yet we can see, perhaps this works when you're thinking about the nation of Israel. Because again, it's a closed community for the most part. It's supposed to be. And the people were all supposed to be governed by the same law. It doesn't work like this in the world because we're not living in a God-governed society. But this is kind of the way that it works, that God would show favor towards those who were careful towards him. And the ones who rebelled against him were stuck with all kinds of laborious tasks. They would never find favor. They would never find peace. So he says in verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. So if you just stop right there, you go, yeah, this really sounds very much like the law. Because God would say that. You walk rightly before me, and if things are right as they're supposed to be fellowship-wise between you and me, then you'll enjoy the fruit of everything that you've worked for. You'll have contentment. But the other ones, if you reject me, you're just going to be stuck at the toil of things. So he says, but to the sinner, He gives the work of gathering and collecting that he may give to him who does good before the Lord. Everything that they will labor for will ultimately be somehow find its way to the people who are walking rightly before the Lord. And this would be disciplinary, hoping that people would kind of understand where they're supposed to be in this whole thing, walking rightly before him and enjoying the fruit of their labor. So he says, this also is vanity and grasping at the wind. So even that recognition, even that understanding, or the people who would do that, if his point is the people who don't want to walk rightly before God are going to only labor for someone else. That is, if that's what he's referring to, that's the vanity and grasping at wind. The idea of enjoying what God has given doesn't seem as though it's a vain thing, because he speaks about it very favorably. So all of his pursuits, he looks at it vain, grasping at wind, all of the futility of it. The only time he ever speaks favorably, and like this is by the hand of God, we see this, that a person can enjoy the fruit of their labor and they can walk rightly before God because he's blessing them. So again, that has a very Old Testament, under the law kind of a feel to it, and it's very different from the world in which we live that is not God governed, because we're among the masses now. This is being written by a Jewish king to a Jewish audience, and they're the children of Israel in the land. So there are some elements to this that, without being said, it's pretty obvious we're speaking about people who are under the law, not looking outside of their family, if you will, the tribes of Israel. So we're going to conclude there, but what we'll get to next week, we're all going to remember it. If you're old enough, there was a band known as the Byrds back in the 60s and 70s. I don't even know how long they went for. But they did this thing. To everything there is a season, for a time and a purpose under heaven, a time to be born. They did this song, and it was a big hit in the world at the time. So when we read through this, you'll go, yeah, they just basically took what was the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and turned it into a commercial hit that was played on the radio all over the, any place where that kind of music was being played. So kind of interesting. Now, as we close this, I want to take a look at a couple of passages, because Paul is kind of the complete kind of flip, polar opposite of Solomon in this. And he could have had, before he was saved, you read about that in Philippians, he had everything at his fingertips. He had a place of really great position, and he could have probably lived a very comfortable life. But those things got in the way of his walk with the Lord, so those were abandoned to him. So he took on a life where he was imprisoned, he was beaten, he was always under threat of death. Didn't have a whole lot to show for his life in the way of possessions. He didn't have any of those things. So he's the complete polar opposite of Solomon, and yet we can learn volumes from both of these guys. So when it comes to the idea, I know that I mentioned it last week, I don't think I mentioned it this week. There are many who would argue, if only I had fill in the blank, if only I had possessions, if only I had money, if only I had this, if only I had that, and all of the things that you can say, if I had that, I would be different than I am, I would be content, I would be happy. We come to find out that those things don't bring any contentment, because Solomon's already proved that. So Paul would say, yeah, but if I'm doing what God wants me to do, I don't need those things. So I want to look at a couple of passages where he says very much those same kinds of things. Let's look at the first one, and it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And I read these just as a way of saying, here's the flip side of it, and what's the difference between a guy like Solomon and a guy like Paul? Jesus. And looking towards the eternal and not the temporal. What you notice here is that Solomon is very much considering the temporal, this earth, this life. He's not looking down the road, other than just by who's going to take my place and what will he do with all the stuff that I've put together. Here, Paul has a very different take on these things. Here's what he says in 2 Corinthians 4:7. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. We are hard pressed on every side, yet we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are already delivered to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. What a difference. What an absolutely astounding, amazing difference. So his point is, again, Solomon's not coming at this from a place of persecution and trouble and all the rest of it. There is no trouble in his life. He's troubled by the fact that he has everything that he could want, trying to find the answers to life, if you will, and he comes to the point of frustration, to the point where it's like it's all vanity. Paul has none of those things, and he's under incredible persecution. Look at that litany of things in verses 7 and 8. And he says, but those things were perplexed. Well, let's just read through them again. They're important. I'm sorry, it's verse 8. We're hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. So otherwise, we would be. We would be crushed by all of this, but for the Lord who's keeping us. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. So that perplexed, like we don't have the answers, but it doesn't cause depression in us. So Paul is a whole different person here, because he basically says, I'm doing what God has apprehended me to do, and whatever happens to me here is just in keeping with what he suffered on my behalf. I'm doing it by extension and passing it along. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, let's go there. 1 Timothy 6. Boy, you could read all of that in all of chapter 6 up to that point, but for time's sake, he says this. Yeah, boy, it's talking about people that the things that they will concern themselves with, and it's really good stuff, but it'll take too long to get through it. He talks about the people that corrupt what is right and what is honorable, what is acceptable doctrinally. And he does that in the beginning part of the chapter. So they will pursue after all kinds of things, and he's going to get to the idea of pursuing after wealth and all the rest of it. But he says this, for them, that's what they're going to do. And as he concludes at verse 5, these are people who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. And from such people withdraw yourself. That idea that, well, if you're walking rightly before him, you'll have all these possessions. Well, kind of puts it down there in Solomon's point of view, where we know where that ends up. No matter what you have, it's never enough. So Paul says here, for godliness now, he says, now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we will carry nothing out. What a difference from what we heard from Solomon. So I'm worried about this. What am I going to do? I've worked for all this stuff. I'm going to leave it to somebody else, and they might be a knucklehead. Here Paul says, whatever it is we might get in this life, we can't take it with us, so whatever. Godliness with contentment, great gain. And he says, and having food and clothing, with these we will be content. So compared to what you saw with Solomon, all the work of my hand, and it still didn't bring me any satisfaction. Here he says, I just need clothes and I need food, and I'm content. So I'm challenged when I read these kind of passages from Paul. And I would want to say that I could always live like he's talking about here. There is a freedom in this man that is mind-boggling to me. And that it's something that we should genuinely understand. With Solomon, he's going to come around to the point where after all of my pursuits and all of the emptiness, he does have a very interesting last couple of verses that he has in the book, which really kind of helps you to understand. You can cut through all of the mistakes and get right to the heart of the matter by reading the end of the book. It's the stuff that's in between that's also incredibly fascinating. But I wanted to put these out there and have you look at the two of them, what Solomon would say and then what Paul would say here, and really the thing that divides them is looking at the eternal, not the temporal, having your eyes on Jesus versus the uncertainty of what happens. Now, I don't believe that Solomon was uncertain about what would happen to him when he dies in the spiritual sense. He doesn't give any impression of that. And, he seems to get it together at the end, which we see in Ecclesiastes here. But the in-between stuff created so much trouble for him and so much, as he would call it, folly. Kind of interesting to watch how he summarizes it all. But that comparison to Paul is, I think, apt. It's important that we see it. So with that, I want to get on to our topic that gets asked all the time. And it really is one of those difficult things to answer because, again, it's the hypothetical. So let's go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 1. Let's go there. And then once we're there, I'll go ahead and set up the premise for what we're going to talk about here. All right. So in Romans 1, we have one of the answers that's often given in this. So here's the hypothetical. What if we were traveling to some place in the world and we found a tribe somewhere out in the remote part of nowhere who have never heard the gospel? And what happens to them if they die and they've never heard about sin, about their responsibility before God, about the death and the resurrection of Jesus and their need for his forgiveness, all the things that is the dividing line between the believing and the unbelieving world. So it's always that hypothetical. Now, do I think when I say it hypothetical, I'm not downplaying it because that obviously exists. I believe that this is kind of the same answer that I would give to the people that would say, well, what about the 3-year-old? That dies of whatever the causes that are there. You know, they didn't accept Jesus, and so are we to believe that they'll be separated from eternity from God? Well, we can find places in the text, a number of different places, where it talks about you have to have a knowledge of it, and that was really kind of what the law was all about, was giving an understanding of what sin is and the consequence of it. So if you have no knowledge of those things, then it has a whole different kind of a way that God's going to look at it. It's like, how is he going to hold somebody responsible for something about which they had absolutely no knowledge? That's one side of the argument. And so I would say that it's a valid argument, that God is infinitely just. And I can trust that when they stand before him, he will know what has taken place in their life. And he will know whether or not there was anything that was shown to them, said to them, or even things that might get them looking on their own. Now, again, it's the hypotheticals make it where it gets kind of complicated. Here's what we see in verse 18 of Romans 1. Let's read this. For he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, these ones who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So again, the question is, who are they? And interesting, we don't know. He's speaking again in hypothetical terms. So does this mean that if a person living in that kind of a situation would look up into the stars and just wonder, what's it all mean? And there's got to be an answer here that God would see that they get their answer. I remember Jack, my pastor, when he was one who believed that God existed because he said somebody had to have created the ants. It was one of his favorite lines. But I guess he really did come to that point at one time. He's looking at ants. He goes, how'd those guys get here? How did it all happen? And he started to ask. It was that line of thinking and that and a number of other things that he really started to pursue the things of the Lord. And of course, it led to him coming to know who the Lord is. So the quick, simple answer to this, is it plausible, by even reading what we read here in Romans, that if a person looks at God's invisible attributes by looking at his creation, that they might reach out to what they're asking. Who made this? Even if they don't know him by name, will God reveal himself in that way? Now, you read about the stories of missionaries who have gone into places and they've, in these remote places where nobody's ever heard of them, and a person would say, I was asking that someone would come and tell me what these things mean. And I couldn't find the story that I had heard years ago, but it was from a missionary who had talked about going in and meeting a group of people, and that they had been trying to figure out how everything that they saw in the sky at night came into being. And they were asking for answers. And here comes a missionary. So you have those stories from time to time. And is that kind of along the lines of what we're seeing here in Romans 1? Well, potentially. But for what Paul is saying, again, he's probably thinking about the world as they know it. So, they've been able to reach the world with the gospel at this point as he's writing Romans here. And has everybody heard it? I don't know. But in our world today, we definitely know this, that the world has not heard a plain presentation of the gospel. And there are many people like that. So then the question comes down very simply to this. If God is ultimately merciful and just is he going to hold somebody responsible for knowledge that they cannot have or do not have? Like with the infant child, someone who has never come to the point of really realizing their need for forgiveness and bowing the knee to Jesus the Messiah and saying, save me and forgive me of my sin. If they've never come to that point, how does God deal with them if he's infinitely merciful and just? And for that, I'm able to say, I have my belief would be that he's going to look at those people and say they have no knowledge of sin. I could be wrong on that, but I ultimately know this, one way or the other, no one will ever be able to shake their fist at God and say, you dealt unfairly with me. No one could ever make that case against him. He is infinitely just. He is infinitely a good, righteous judge. And he has given man a way to be reconciled to him. So what about the people who have never heard? They're a different category. The people who have heard and rejected, that is, again, they're responsible for what they know. So interesting question. Hopefully that answers it for some people. Again, I can fall on this. God is infinitely just and merciful and loving, and he will hold people accountable for what they have done based on what they know, I believe. And I think you can make that case from a lot of places. But at the same time, there is the creation that testifies of who he is. And so there should be a curiosity in people, as Paul is trying to point out here. Again, his world's a bit different than ours. I don't think he knows about all the different far-flung places. And this is really in the first just several decades after Jesus had come and lived and died and resurrected. So the gospel was just starting to make its way around the world. Anyhow, very, very interesting, and it's a great question. I know it's not an easy one to answer to everyone's satisfaction, but that is kind of how I would frame it. And if people wanted to discuss it further, debate it, then doors open. If you have any questions on any of what's been shared here today, contact us through the ministry, oldpaththeology.net, and there's an email that you can send, an email link there that you can send to me, and I'll be happy to correspond with you if you have any questions, the Israel trip, any of those kind of things, or even our topics today. So we will pick up at chapter 3 next week.